Fort Hood, Texas. The largest military base in the United States. Where thousands of soldiers train every single day. Where helicopters cut through the Texas sky like steel birds hunting prey. But something was wrong with the birds. And nobody knew how to fix it. Major Dan Hartley sat in the operations office, staring at the problem report for the 100th time. The AH-64 Apache helicopters kept experiencing a critical malfunction during combat simulations. The targeting system would lock up. The hydraulic controls would hesitate. And for just a moment, sometimes 2 seconds, sometimes 5, the pilot lost full control of the aircraft. 2 seconds doesn't sound long. But in a helicopter that weighs 4,500 pounds and flies at 150 miles per hour, 2 seconds can be the difference between life and death. They'd brought in engineers from Boeing. They'd brought in systems specialists from the Army's Research and Development Command. They'd consulted with the manufacturer's top technical team. For 3 months, the best minds in military aviation had been analyzing this problem. And they had nothing. "It's a ghost," one of the Boeing engineers had said yesterday. "We can replicate the condition 50% of the time. But we can't figure out why it happens. The systems seem fine. The hydraulics check out. The targeting computer runs all its diagnostics and shows no errors." Dan had built his career on solving problems. He was a combat-tested pilot who transitioned into operations management. He understood how Apache helicopters worked. He'd flown them. He'd trusted them with his life. But this problem was different. This wasn't something you could see. It wasn't something that showed up on a diagnostic screen. It was something that only happened during real flying conditions. Something that only happened to certain pilots. Something that made no sense. The base commander, Colonel James Richardson, had made it clear, "Fix this problem, or we ground the entire Apache fleet. And if we ground the Apache fleet, the Army loses its most powerful attack helicopter during a critical period of operations." That meant political pressure from Washington. That meant angry generals. That meant careers could end. Dan understood the stakes. Everyone understood the stakes. His phone rang. It was his secretary, Patricia. "Sir, there's someone here to see you. She says it's about the Apache problem." "Who is it?" Dan asked. "She won't give her name. But she says you should trust her. She says she used to fly Apaches." Dan almost hung up. He didn't have time for cranks or people claiming they had miraculous solutions. But something in Patricia's voice made him pause. "Send her in," he said. The woman who walked through the door was probably in her mid-60s. She had gray hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of posture that came from years of military training. She wore jeans and a blue blazer. Nothing military. Nothing official. But something about her commanded attention anyway. "Major Hartley," she said, extending her hand. "My name is Captain Ellen Reeves. Retired. I heard you had a problem with the Apache." Dan shook her hand. Her grip was firm. "I appreciate the offer to help," Dan said carefully. "But we've already brought in the best engineers money can buy. We've been working on this for 3 months. "I know," Ellen said. She pulled a chair up to his desk without asking permission and sat down. "I know because my niece is stationed here. She's a communications officer. And she mentioned that the best engineers money could buy were stumped by an Apache that keeps glitching during certain flight patterns." Dan studied her. There was something familiar about her. Something he couldn't quite place. "You flew Apaches?" he asked. "For 28 years, Ellen said. Combat tours in Iraq. Afghanistan. Libya. I was a company commander. I trained pilots. I led assault missions. And I retired 3 years ago with the rank of captain." The rank was lower than Dan would have expected given her experience, but he didn't ask why. Military careers were complicated. Sometimes the politics pushed talented people out before they achieved their full potential. What do you think the problem is? Dan asked. I don't know, Ellen said honestly. Not yet. But I'd like to see the aircraft. I'd like to see the maintenance logs. And I'd like to talk to the pilots who've experienced the malfunction. Dan hesitated. This went against protocol. You didn't let random retired pilots access military aircraft or classified flight data. But something about Ellen made him want to trust her. Give me 1 hour, he said. 1 hour to review this with command. If they approve it, we'll show you everything. Ellen smiled. It was a knowing smile. A smile that suggested she'd expected exactly this response. 1 hour is fine, she said. I'll wait in the lobby. Dan called Colonel Richardson. He explained the situation carefully. He emphasized that Ellen was retired military, that she had real experience flying Apaches, and that they'd been stuck for 3 months. What do we have to lose? Dan asked. We've tried everything else. Richardson was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised Dan. I know Captain Ellen Reeves, he said. I served with her years ago, before she transferred to Special Operations. She's brilliant. If she says she can help, I believe her. Clear her for everything. Do whatever she needs. 1 hour later, Ellen was standing in the hangar next to an Apache helicopter. The aircraft was sleek and predatory, covered in weapons systems and sensors. The newest version, state-of-the-art. Tell me what the pilots say happens, Ellen said. Dan brought up the flight reports on a tablet. The malfunction occurs during rapid descent combined with tight turns. The pilots say they're in a bombing run pattern, coming down fast to get a better targeting angle, then pulling out hard to avoid ground fire. About 5 seconds into the turn, the targeting system locks up. The hydraulic response time increases. For a few seconds, it's like flying a plane made of mud instead of titanium. Ellen listened without interrupting. She studied the flight patterns. She read the technical diagnostics. She asked about wind conditions, pilot training levels, time of day, everything. Show me the diagnostic readouts from the last malfunction, she said. Dan pulled them up. Pages of technical data. System checks. All showing normal parameters. All showing that everything was working fine. Ellen stared at the data for a long time. Then she asked to see the Apache's actual flight control computer. The engineer on site, a young man named Steve from Boeing, brought it over. It was a box about the size of a small laptop, filled with circuits and processors. Ellen opened it carefully. She examined the components. She looked at the wiring. She traced the connections. How often do they upgrade the software, she asked. Every 6 months, Steve said. There's a new patch that came out 2 months ago. Ellen nodded slowly. Did the malfunction start happening right after the update, she asked. Steve's face went pale. I'm not sure. Let me check. He pulled up the maintenance logs. He cross-referenced the dates when the malfunction first appeared with the software update timeline. Oh my God, he said quietly. Yes. The first report of the problem came in exactly 4 days after the software update was deployed. Ellen didn't say anything. She just smiled. She put the flight control computer on the desk and pointed to one of the circuit boards. The new software has a conflict with the pressure sensor calibration, she said. When the aircraft is in a specific configuration, nose down, banking hard, the pressure readings spike. The computer thinks there's a hydraulic surge. So it automatically reduces control response time by 50 milliseconds. It's a safety protocol. It's trying to prevent damage to the hydraulic system. But it's not a surge, Steve said, understanding dawning. The pilots are just flying hard. Exactly, Ellen said. The new software is too aggressive with its safety protocols. It's designed for a different flight envelope than what combat pilots actually use. The protocol was probably tested in simulators, but simulators don't capture everything that happens in real flight conditions. Steve was already on his phone, calling the software team back at Boeing. Within 15 minutes, they'd confirmed Ellen's analysis. Within 30 minutes, they were sending a corrected software patch. Ellen turned to Dan. You need to ground the Apaches until this patch is installed. After that, the problem will be gone. Dan stared at her. It had taken Ellen 45 minutes to solve a problem that had stumped the best engineers in the military for 3 months. 45 minutes. How did you know? He asked. Ellen shrugged. I've flown thousands of hours in an Apache. I know what it feels like when a helicopter is responding normally and when it's not. I know the systems. I know the limitations. And I know that the most dangerous problems are usually the simple ones that get hidden under layers of complexity. She stood up to leave. Wait, Dan said. Will you stay? Will you consult with us? The Army will pay you. We'll bring you in officially. Ellen looked back at him. There was something sad in her expression. Something resigned. No, she said. I've done my part. Now it's your turn to fix the systems that are broken. What do you mean? Dan asked. I mean, Ellen said, that an Apache is just a machine. What broke here wasn't the helicopter. What broke here was the process. The procedure. The way men like you overlooked the simplest solution because you were too busy looking for complicated ones. She walked toward the hangar exit. And next time, she said without turning around, before you bring in the expensive consultants, maybe you should ask a retired pilot who actually knows how to fly the damn thing. Then she was gone, disappearing into the Texas heat like a ghost. Dan stood in the hangar, staring at the space where she'd been. And he realized something. He realized that Ellen Reeves had just taught him a lesson that no MBA program could teach. Sometimes the best solutions come from people you overlook. Sometimes the answer to your biggest problems comes from someone who's been forgotten. And sometimes, a retired female pilot could do more good in 45 minutes than all the experts in the world. The software patch was installed on every Apache in the fleet within 48 hours. Test flights confirmed what Ellen had said, the malfunction was completely eliminated. The problem that had stumped everyone for 3 months was solved. Dan expected a celebration. He expected some recognition. He expected that everyone involved would understand the value of what had just happened. Instead, he got a call from Colonel Richardson telling him to come to his office immediately. Shut the door, Richardson said when Dan arrived. His face was red. His voice was controlled, but barely. Do you understand what you did? Richardson asked. Sir, I don't. You brought a retired officer into a classified facility without proper vetting, Richardson continued. You gave her access to our most sensitive systems. You let her examine aircraft systems that are part of active military operations. And you did all of this based on a personal recommendation from me that I shouldn't have given without proper authorization. Sir, she solved the problem, Dan said. I don't care if she solved the problem, Richardson said, standing up. I don't care if she walked on water. The procedure matters. The protocol matters. And you violated both. Dan felt his face getting hot. With all due respect, sir, we were stuck. We tried everything else. We had. You had experts, Richardson interrupted. Real experts. Engineers from Boeing. Military engineers with advanced degrees. And instead of trusting the process, instead of showing patience while they did their jobs correctly, you went around the system and consulted with someone who had no official capacity, no clearance, and no business being anywhere near those aircraft. But she was right, Dan said. That's irrelevant, Richardson said. The Army is a system. Systems function according to rules and procedures. When people start ignoring those rules, even when they get good results, the entire system breaks down. Do you understand what I'm saying? Dan understood exactly what Richardson was saying. He was saying that the system was more important than the problem. The procedure was more important than the solution. Yes, sir, Dan said quietly. I'm going to have to file a report on this, Richardson said. I'm going to have to explain how a retired officer accessed classified materials without proper clearance. And you're going to have to explain why you authorized it. Yes, sir. You may have just ended your career, Major, Richardson said. I hope solving one problem was worth it. Dan left Richardson's office feeling sick. He'd done the right thing. He'd solved the problem. And now he was going to be punished for it. Over the next few days, Dan's concerns became reality. A formal investigation was launched. Military lawyers started asking questions. It became clear that while Ellen had solved the problem, bringing her in had violated multiple regulations and security protocols. The Boeing engineers were questioned. They confirmed that Ellen's analysis was correct, but they also confirmed that she'd been given access to proprietary information without proper authorization. There were rules about that. Rules existed to protect military secrets. Dan's commanding officer told him to prepare for a possible discharge. Not dishonorable, but a mark on his record that would end any chance of advancement. At best, he'd be reassigned to a desk job. At worst, he'd be forced out of the military entirely. And nobody talked about Ellen Reeves anymore. Nobody mentioned the woman who'd solved the problem. The focus was entirely on Dan's procedural violations. A week after Richardson's initial meeting, Dan was contacted by the Army's legal team. They wanted to know everything about Ellen. Her background. Why he'd trusted her. How she'd heard about the problem. She said her niece works here as a communications officer, Dan said. They found the niece. Her name was Catherine Reeves. She was 26 years old. She'd been stationed at Fort Hood for 8 months. When they questioned Catherine, she revealed something that shocked everyone. My Aunt Ellen didn't just randomly come to help, Catherine said. She'd been trying to get the Army to consult with her for the past 3 months. She'd been calling, sending emails, trying to get someone to listen to her. But nobody would take her seriously. Nobody would return her calls. Why didn't she say that? The investigator asked. Because she's too proud, Catherine said. Ellen never complains. She just goes to work and does what needs to be done. But yes, she tried to help officially. The Army rejected her. So she came anyway. This revelation changed the entire narrative. Suddenly, Dan wasn't the problem. The system was the problem. The system had rejected Ellen's offers of help. The system had ignored a valuable resource. The system had forced Ellen to go around the rules because the rules wouldn't let her help in the first place. Dan decided to find Ellen. It took him 2 weeks, but he eventually tracked her down to a small town outside Austin. She was working at a flight school, teaching civilians how to fly helicopters. When Dan walked into the office, Ellen looked up from her desk. She didn't look surprised. It was like she'd been expecting him. Hello, Major, she said. I wanted to thank you, Dan said. And I wanted to apologize. I wanted to tell you that I didn't know you'd been trying to help officially. I didn't know the Army had rejected you. Ellen stood up and walked to the window. Outside, you could see the runway where small aircraft were taking off and landing. Of course they rejected me, she said quietly. Do you know why I retired when I did, Major? Dan didn't answer. He just listened. I retired because I'd had enough, Ellen continued. I'd spent 30 years fighting. Fighting in combat. Fighting in meetings. Fighting against assumptions about what women could do. Fighting against systems that were designed by men, for men, and that had no space for women who didn't fit the mold. She turned to face Dan. "I was a pilot," she said. "A good one. Maybe the best pilot your base has ever had. But I never got promoted to major. You know why? Because I asked too many questions. Because I pushed back on decisions I thought were wrong. Because I didn't play the politics game. And because I was a woman, and women who speak up are seen as difficult." Dan felt something settle heavily in his chest. "So when I retired," Ellen continued, "I thought I was done. I thought I'd give myself permission to not fight anymore. I thought I'd just teach civilians how to fly and live a quiet life. But then you heard about the Apache problem," Dan said. "My niece told me," Ellen said. "And I knew I could help. And I knew that if I tried to help through the system would reject me. Because that's what systems do when they don't want to listen to women." "So you came anyway," Dan said. "I came anyway," Ellen agreed. "And I solved the problem. And then the system punished you for letting me help. Because the system doesn't care about solutions. The system cares about control." Dan felt tears forming. He wasn't sure if it was anger or shame or frustration or all three. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Ellen smiled sadly. "I want you to understand something. The army isn't evil. But it's a system built on hierarchy and rules. And systems like that are designed to protect themselves, not to solve problems. They're designed to maintain power structures, not to find truth." "So nothing changes," Dan said bitterly. "No," Ellen said. "It changes. But only if people inside the system, people like you, decide that change matters more than protection. Only if people like you are willing to risk something to make things better." She walked over to Dan and put a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," she said. "The army might punish you for it. But you did the right thing. And that matters. It matters more than you might understand right now." Dan thought about Ellen's words every day. He went through the formal investigation. He answered lawyers' questions. He documented everything that had happened. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon, he made a decision that would change everything. He contacted a journalist. A woman named Rebecca Chen who worked for a military affairs publication called Defense Today. He told her the entire story, not to protect himself, but to expose what had happened to Ellen. The army had a brilliant solution available to them, Dan told Rebecca. A retired female pilot who could have solved this problem immediately if they'd let her. Instead, they rejected her offers of help and wasted millions of dollars and 3 months of time. And when I finally brought her in as a last resort, I was punished for it." Rebecca was interested. She started digging. She interviewed Dan. She interviewed Ellen. She talked to the engineers from Boeing. She obtained copies of Ellen's attempts to contact the army with her concerns. The emails were damning. Ellen had sent 8 emails over 3 months to different people at Fort Hood. Offering her expertise. Offering to consult. Offering to help solve the problem. Every single email had gone unanswered. Every single one. Rebecca's article ran under a headline that made national news: "Female retired pilot solves Apache mystery that stumped experts, after Army ignored her offers to help." The article detailed everything. It named names. It quoted Ellen. It showed the email chain proving the Army had rejected her. It quoted Dan about his disciplinary investigation. And it asked a simple question: is the U.S. military's reluctance to listen to women costing us in ways we haven't even calculated yet? The article went viral. It was shared thousands of times. It was referenced on cable news. Military officers were asked to comment on it during interviews. Colonel Richardson faced immediate questions from his superiors. The Air Force's Inspector General opened an investigation into how the Army had handled Ellen's requests for access. Congressional staffers started asking questions about whether women were being systematically excluded from important military decisions. And suddenly, the narrative changed completely. Dan wasn't under investigation anymore. Instead, the army was under investigation. And Ellen wasn't a retired pilot who'd overstepped. She was a valued expert who'd been treated unfairly. Ellen was contacted by the Army's Human Resources Department. They apologized. They offered her a position as a consultant. They offered her back pay for the 3 months she should have been involved in solving the problem. She declined the money but accepted the consultant position. Dan's disciplinary record was wiped clean. Instead of facing discharge, he was promoted to Major Colonel. The message was clear: the Army wasn't going to let this story hurt him. The Army was going to make sure he looked like a hero for bringing in Ellen, not a rule breaker. But Dan knew the truth. The system had only changed course because it had to. Because the publicity forced it to. Because ignoring Ellen had become more expensive than listening to her. Ellen herself became something of a celebrity. She gave interviews. She spoke at military academies. She became a symbol of women who'd been overlooked by institutions that claimed to value them. But the most important thing happened 3 months after the article ran. Ellen was invited to Fort Hood to give a speech to all the pilots and maintenance crew at the base. To tell her story. To talk about her experience. To help the institution understand what they'd been missing. Dan attended the speech. So did Colonel Richardson. So did hundreds of officers and enlisted personnel. Ellen stood in front of the group. She looked smaller than Dan remembered. Less powerful. Just a woman in her 60s, with gray hair and worn hands. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty," she began. "I'm here to tell you something you need to know. The military is strong because it attracts talented people. Talented people of all kinds. Men and women. People from different backgrounds. Different experiences. Different perspectives." She paused. "But a system is only as strong as its willingness to listen to those people," she continued. "If you reject talent because it comes wrapped in the wrong gender. If you ignore solutions because they come from someone who doesn't fit the mold you've created. If you hold on to your procedures even when they're keeping you from solving critical problems. Then you're not strong. You're weak. You're brittle. And you're vulnerable." The room was silent. "I'm not telling you this because I'm angry," Ellen said. "I'm telling you this because I care about the military. I've spent my entire life serving this country. And I know that the military only wins when it has all of its talent available to it. When it listens to the best ideas, wherever they come from. When it values solutions more than procedures." She looked directly at Colonel Richardson. "I know why you didn't listen to me," she said. "Not because you're a bad person. You're not. You're a good officer trying to follow the rules you were given. But the rules you were given didn't account for situations like this. And when the rules don't work, good people have to be brave enough to change them." After the speech, Ellen was surrounded by people wanting to talk to her. Wanting to thank her. Wanting to understand her perspective. Dan watched from a distance. He saw Ellen shaking hands with young female pilots. He saw her talking to engineers. He saw her giving advice to officers who were clearly struggling with their own questions about how things worked in the military. And he understood something profound. Ellen hadn't come back for vindication or recognition. She'd come back to plant seeds. To show the next generation of military personnel, especially the women, that they didn't have to accept the way things had always been done. That they could push back. That they could speak up. That they could change the system from within. Ellen finally had the opportunity to talk to Dan before she left. "Thank you for telling my story," she said. "Thank you for being willing to be uncomfortable to do the right thing. What will you do now?" Dan asked. "I'm going to consult with the military," Ellen said. "I'm going to help them figure out how to listen better. How to find talent wherever it is. How to make room for people like me. And I'm going to work with that journalist, Rebecca, on a book about women in the military. About how much talent we've wasted by not listening. That's going to make people uncomfortable, Dan said. Good, Ellen said. Uncomfortable is where change happens. 6 months after Ellen's speech, everything changed. The Army issued new guidelines for accessing subject matter expertise. They created a database of retired military personnel who were available to consult on specific problems. They established procedures for quickly bringing in outside expertise when internal solutions weren't working. More importantly, they began questioning the assumption that official processes always produced the best results. They started asking, what if the best solution comes from someone we haven't thought to ask? What if we're so committed to following procedures that we're missing opportunities? Ellen became the face of this change. She consulted on multiple projects. She worked with Boeing to improve their software development procedures. And she established something called the External Expertise Initiative, a program designed to make sure that valuable perspectives weren't being rejected simply because they came through unofficial channels. But the most significant change happened quietly, in the culture of the military itself. Young officers started asking harder questions about whether they should follow procedures blindly or whether they should speak up when they thought something was wrong. Women in the military began to understand that being overlooked wasn't inevitable. That they could fight back. That institutions could change if enough people pushed hard enough. Dan was promoted again. He moved to a new position where he had authority over how the Army approached problem solving. And the first thing he did was bring Ellen in to help redesign the entire system. We need to stop thinking about procedures as rules, Ellen told him during their first planning meeting. We need to think about them as guidelines. Good guidelines. But not sacred laws. When a problem doesn't fit the procedure, we need to be willing to step outside it. Dan implemented her advice. And the results were remarkable. The Army began solving problems faster. They began accessing talent they'd previously overlooked. And they began developing a reputation for being willing to listen to good ideas, regardless of where they came from. 2 years after Ellen had walked into Dan's office that first time, the Army published a report on the new procedures. The report credited Ellen Reeves with revolutionizing how the military approaches problem solving. It called her one of the most significant consultants in modern military history. Ellen read the report and laughed. I just flew helicopters, she told Dan when they met for coffee. I just pointed out what should have been obvious. That sometimes the people with the best answers aren't the ones with the biggest titles. You did more than that, Dan said. You forced the system to look at itself honestly. You showed that the system was broken and that it needed to change. The system is always broken in some way, Ellen said. Because systems are made by humans, and humans are always learning. The question is whether institutions are willing to keep learning or whether they get stuck. Dan's phone buzzed. A text from Colonel Richardson, I'm recommending the External Expertise Initiative for expansion to all Army bases. Ellen's work is changing how we operate. Dan showed the text to Ellen. Good, Ellen said. Now the real work starts. Because changing procedures is easy. Changing the culture that created those procedures, that's hard. That takes time. That takes people inside the system being willing to constantly question what they're doing and why they're doing it. She sipped her coffee. And that's why I'm staying, she said. Not because the problem is solved. But because the problem is just beginning to be understood. 5 years after Ellen Reeves walked into Dan Hartley's office with a solution to the Apache problem, something remarkable happened. The Army published a retrospective study on innovation and problem solving. The study examined hundreds of military projects and asked a simple question: which projects solved their problems fastest and most effectively? The answer surprised exactly nobody who'd been paying attention: the projects that had been willing to bring in outside expertise. The projects that had questioned their own procedures. The projects that had treated good ideas as more important than following rules. Ellen had become a legend in military circles. But she didn't want to be a legend. She wanted to be forgotten. Not in a bad way. But in the way that meant her work had become so integrated into the system that nobody even noticed it anymore. The way that meant change had become permanent. She was invited to speak at the Naval Academy. She was invited to consult with the Air Force. She was invited to advise the Defense Department on how to make the entire military more receptive to innovation. But the thing Ellen was most proud of wasn't any of those official recognitions. It was something smaller. More personal. A young female pilot named Sarah Martinez had joined the Air Force after hearing Ellen's story on the news. Sarah graduated top of her class. She became a helicopter pilot. And when she encountered a problem that her superiors didn't want to hear about, she remembered Ellen Reeves and spoke up anyway. Sarah's findings saved money and improved operations. And she became a story that the next generation of female pilots learned about. And then there was another pilot. And another. And another. A chain of women who understood that speaking up mattered. That your voice had value. That the system could change if you were brave enough to push it. Ellen met with each of them. She didn't tell them they'd be heroes or famous or celebrated. She just told them to keep pushing. To keep questioning. To keep insisting that their ideas had value. On a quiet afternoon in April, 5 years after the Apache problem had been solved, Ellen sat in her office at the flight school. The walls were decorated with photos from her military career. Her in cockpits. Her with her squadron. Her standing in front of Apaches with the Texas heat shimmering around them. She was writing a letter. A letter to all the young women in the military. A letter that she hoped would be published someday. A letter about what she'd learned from all of this. I've been thinking, she wrote, about what it means to be invisible. I spent 30 years in the military making myself smaller so that people would take me seriously. Making myself quieter so that I wouldn't be seen as difficult. Hiding my brilliance so that I wouldn't threaten the men around me. And then one day, I realized I'd spent 30 years of my life making myself invisible. And I'd had enough. That's why I came to Fort Hood that day. Not because I expected to be welcomed. Not because I thought the system would suddenly start valuing me. But because I'd finally decided that being invisible wasn't acceptable. That my knowledge had value. That my experience mattered. And something amazing happened. When I stopped trying to be invisible, the system had to respond. Not because it wanted to. But because I wouldn't let it ignore me anymore. So this is what I want to say to every young woman in the military, and every woman everywhere who feels like her voice doesn't matter. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. Your knowledge matters. And if the people around you can't see that, it's not because you're not good enough. It's because they're not smart enough to listen. Keep pushing. Keep speaking up. Keep insisting on your own value. Because the world needs what you have to offer. And the world will never be as strong as it could be until it finally learns to listen. Ellen finished the letter and set it aside. She knew it would be published someday. She knew her story would be told and retold. And she was okay with that, as long as it helped other women understand their own power. There was a knock on her office door. It was Dan. He'd traveled to Austin to visit her. I wanted to tell you something, Dan said, sitting down across from her. I'm retiring from the military next month. I'm going to work full-time with the External Expertise Initiative. I'm going to travel around to military bases and help them implement the procedures we developed. I'm going to make sure your legacy continues. Ellen felt tears in her eyes, but she smiled. That's wonderful, she said. But remember, it's not my legacy. It's everyone's legacy. Every person who decides to speak up. Every officer who decides to listen. Every institution that decides to value ideas over procedures. It started with you, Dan said. No, Ellen said. It started with every woman before me who tried to speak up and wasn't listened to. I just happened to be the one who was finally in the right place at the right time with someone who was willing to listen. After Dan left, Ellen stood at the window of her office and looked out at the runway. She could see helicopters in the distance, practicing maneuvers. She could see young pilots learning their trade. She thought about that first day when she'd walked into Major Hartley's office. She hadn't known what would happen. She hadn't known that one small act of speaking up would lead to this. But she understood now what she'd learned: change doesn't come from the people in power deciding to change. Change comes from the people without power deciding to stop being silent. The Apache problem was solved. The fuel system was fixed. The targeting glitch was eliminated. But the real problem, the problem of institutions not listening to the people who have the most to teach them, that problem was still being solved. It would be solved for generations to come. And Ellen Reeves had helped start that process. Not by being extraordinary, but by simply refusing to be invisible anymore. Years later, there would be a statue in the flight school at Fort Hood. Not of Ellen directly, but of a female pilot, with her hand up, speaking. The plaque beneath it read, "For Captain Ellen Reeves, who taught us to listen." Ellen would visit that statue sometimes. She'd stand in front of it and remember that young woman, Sarah, Maria, Jessica, and dozens of others, who'd had the courage to speak up because Ellen had shown them it was possible. And she'd understand, finally, that the greatest gift you could give someone wasn't recognition or fame. It was permission. Permission to be brave. Permission to speak up. Permission to refuse to be invisible anymore. That was Ellen's real legacy. Not solving the Apache problem in 45 minutes. But showing the military, and the world, that the most powerful solutions often come from the people we've been overlooking all along. And sometimes, it just takes one person who's brave enough to say, "Listen to me. I have something important to tell you." And the system, finally, begins to change.